Small Town Redditors, what's the weirdest unsolved crime in your town, old or new? Fight the Bastard said. Nowhere near the scale of disappearing children or Nazi collaborators, but my hometown's biggest mystery is who keeps shitting in the holes at the golf course. Person has been doing it for more than 20 years. Every 2-3 months, there's a hole that's been shut in. Madam Ray said. About 30 years ago, a refuse worker found a badly burned body of an 18-month-old boy amongst the bags in recycling. Forensics deduced that due to the condition of his liver, he died less than a week before his body was found. Hospital and medical records were used to establish that nobody in the county was missing a child. He doesn't have a name in his gravestone. Edit. It was in Cumbria, England. The police likely didn't retain a DNA sample, or we might have heard something about familial DNA by now. The local police aren't very good. Look up the case of Poppy Worthington as an example. Most local people assume he died of SIDS, then his parents panicked and tried to conceal his body. Whoever did it must have had an element of local knowledge in order to know where to put the corpse. BBB24 said. There is a street in my city called Park Avenue. It's a very small city, mostly blue-collar. In 2005, a newborn baby boy was found dead near a factory on Park Avenue. Doctors could tell he was born alive and likely lived for a few hours before he died. I don't know if he was abandoned, left to die, or killed in some way. That info was never released. Police made a statement saying, "Please come forward, we want to help you bury this child properly." The mother sent an anonymous letter to the police station 2 weeks later, and said she would come to the station soon. The letter didn't explain the circumstances, but it did say she was afraid. She never came forward. The baby was named Baby Parker and money was raised to give him a proper burial. People still leave gifts at his grave. User Avatar said. So not exactly from a small town but is baffling. Happened this year. A man rented a room at a guest house. When he left, the host went to go prepare the room for the next occupant. The room was covered in blood. In the shower there was a chair with a pool of blood. It is assumed the person died in the chair. So the baffling part is that there is a camera trained in the room's door. The man entered and left alone without a speck of blood on him. The authorities assumed the blood belonged to a woman whose chopped up body was found in a nearby dam. Blood tests came back and it doesn't. User Avatar said. I found out my grandma played cards with the mob in a liquor store basement. I was reading a news article on a cold case from the former owner disappearing for an English assignment and my grandma kinda just frowned, told me she used to play cards with him and never paid his debts. Just Another Daydream 3 said. Just want to jump on here and say to any current and future camp counselors, be aware that the kids you work with could sleepwalk and might not tell you. I used to sleepwalk when I was younger and it just suddenly stopped and I hadn't in years, until I went on a camping trip. I hadn't told anyone that it could happen cause I hadn't slept walks in so long I didn't think it was possible. Luckily 2 of my friends were awake at the time and managed to stop me from walking out, though they didn't realize I was still asleep. After this I went and told the teachers and messaged my parents and they ended up keeping a closer eye on my group's tent at night. Fortunately it didn't happen again and it's only happened a few times since, normally when I'm really stressed. Love or Oxytocin said. I love how the article goes into an in-depth explanation of Capture the Flag, like that's what we came to read. Kid disappears, but check out this awesome game you can play. Regretful Bastard said. It isn't even close to half of the article. I read it and the explanation given is both useful. I didn't have a clue how this game was played, and relevant. The boy vanished while playing it, and it's a game that involves being alone and out of sight. It occupies maybe a sixth of the text, not much else. It is a very comprehensive article that includes all the information known plus some hard-to-read remarks on the parents' grief. You guys are being unfair to the writer demeaning the article like that. Regretful Bastard said. It isn't even close to half of the article. I read it and the explanation given is both useful. I didn't have a clue how this game was played, and relevant. The boy vanished while playing it, and it's a game that involves being alone and out of sight. It occupies maybe a sixth of the text, not much else. It is a very comprehensive article that includes all the information known plus some hard-to-read remarks on the parents' grief. You guys are being unfair to the writer demeaning the article like that. Regretful Bastard said. I read it, and the explanation given is both useful. I didn't have a clue how this game was played, and relevant. The boy vanished while playing it, and it's a game that involves being alone and out of sight. It occupies maybe a sixth of the text, not much else. It is a very comprehensive article that includes all the information known plus some hard-to-read remarks on the parents' grief. You guys are being unfair to the writer demeaning the article like that. My account 12 said, when I got the swimming merit badge in Boy Scouts, they taught a method of making a makeshift flotation device with wet clothing. This could or could not be related, but is it possible he was trying to do the same with his parka? It was still zipped slightly at the bottom, which could be consistent with taking it off and starting to rezip it. The clothes have to be completely closed and wet in order to trap air in them, then somehow losing it before completing this. That's just where my head went. Probably not the answer, but it could be. Edit. This also doesn't answer why his body was never found, assuming he drowned afterward, which is obviously a far more important question. Super Trojan said, read the piece. First thought was that playing Capture the Flag, one of my favorite camp activities, struck me as being risky in that kind of environment. The times I played it were at Drake summer camp, and it was always played RT in camp amongst the cabins, mess hall, other structures, and always at midday or early afternoon, never at night and never if we were out of camp and out in the woods. I was a Boy Scout during the 70s and we never played Capture the Flag out on our campouts, with the dense woods and a body of ice-filled water rushing evidently not too far away, coupled with playing the game at night is really pushing the envelope. Plus he was not missing until bed check. Didn't his team wonder where he was after the game was done? If the other boys all said they did not see him? The troop leaders? Jeffrey said, missing child cold cases are the worst. Must be so hard for the parents, never knowing what happened to your child. We had a case in 1991, Michael Dunahy, 4 years old. He disappeared from a school playground and there's never been any evidence or body found. His parents still believe he's alive somewhere and hold on to that he'll be found one day. So sad. Let us watch Twin Peaks said. Interested to know if the coat was inside out, being that it was somewhat zipped it could have been caught and he slipped out of it, but that would have caused it to, in the least, have the arms inside out. Also, wonder if there are any areas with rocks nearby. Powerx said. I was going to ask if bad weather rolled in shortly after but didn't want to bother you. For some reason a lot of these weird cases where a kid vanishes there is often bad weather right after it happens. In this case snow. There is also usually bodies of water nearby and a few other factors. It was in the missing 411. There are some really strange cases of kids disappearing and sometimes being found but 10-15 miles away. It's really sad and I'm sorry you've had to have this burden of losing your friend and not even knowing how it happened. Powerx Super Trojan said. Sorry to hear that. Were you on the trip? I was a Boy Scout in the Midwest and the places we went camping were gorgeous but also finite in terms of space, so if one of us went off trail it would not be super hard to find us. Plus there were roads and other people around. The summer week had loads of troops and the Explorer Scouts were camped across the lake so it was covered. Where was his troop when he went missing? I was going to ask if bad weather rolled in shortly after but didn't want to bother you. For some reason a lot of these weird cases where a kid vanishes there is often bad weather right after it happens. In this case snow. There is also usually bodies of water nearby and a few other factors. It was in the missing 411. There are some really strange cases of kids disappearing and sometimes being found but 10-15 miles away. It's really sad and I'm sorry you've had to have this burden of losing your friend and not even knowing how it happened. Sizzle Franz said. Holy shit, I'm just now reading up on this. I was a Girl Scout in the 90s and early zeros, and I have so many questions about how this happened. How many scouts were members of Troop 101, and out of that particular troop's total membership number, how many scouts from Troop 101 went on the camping trip? Was Troop 101 the only camper staying in near the Kiwanis cabins and participating in this excursion along the Cedar River, or were there multiple troops present such as an annual scouting jamboree? How many scoutmasters and den leaders were present? How many volunteer parent chaperones were on the camping trip? Did the adult chaperones participate in the game of Capture the Flag, like for example having the troops divide into a manageable of groups, each consisting of an equal and manageable Amount of team members per group, with each team being assigned an adult guide for the kids to accompany and supervise, to be there for scouts who might need assistance in cases of emergency, injury, navigating not getting lost, and to identify a wide array of potential dangers and hazards like poison ivy, poison oak, venomous animals like snakes or spiders, etc. Sizzle Fraz said, I just feel like an official scout-sponsored event like a troop camping trip would require a proportionate ratio of participating children to adult volunteer chaperones like the den leader scoutmaster, depending on the size of the troop at least 3-5 parent volunteers, or even a qualified adolescent scout leader, i.e. Eagle Scout. Make it make sense to me. Who in their right mind would send their 11-year-old into unfamiliar woods near a creek bed rapids, unsupervised or inadequately supervised? I just don't get it from a parenting and an organizational POV. Even if not specifically an official rule in the Scouts BSA handbook, common sense and a very basic rudimentary understanding of both the nature of the untamed wilderness juxtaposed with the behavioral chaos that's guaranteed to ensue whenever a mid to large-sized group of children travel together anywhere special. Special meaning here somewhere they don't normally frequent together. Where the children are acting as both a collective unified group beholden to the established ideals, goals, decisions, and actions of the group as a whole being its own singular entity, while also having each group member acting on their own prerogatives as individual members of that group. But not somewhere mundane, familiar, or routine like a school classroom, the designated Boy Scout troop's meeting spot, or like a Sunday school for example. I mean like taking a horde load of kids to places like to learn and educate on the area's purpose significance, maybe like the architecture, a unique landscape or ecosystem, or a place of historical importance, etc. And then to have all the children in attendance to participate in some novel beneficial experience and or be exposed to a niche activity or new skill under the official capacity of some type of organization. D-Mailer said, this has happened a number of times in the Boston area. Young able-bodied people, mostly men, disappear from bars or clubs and are eventually found in the harbor, the river or another body of water. There's a lot of crazy conspiracy theories and talk of a serial killer, but it seems to be just a combination of alcohol, the dark and an unfamiliarity with the area. They make a string of poor choices, wind up too close to the water, then fall in and drown when there's nobody around to notice. T-Fungus said, one time my class went on a camping trip, and this one kid that was in my friend group kept trying to convince me to leave our camp and go into the Grand Canyon with him and run away to Texas. Back then running away was appealing for both of us, but the planning was terrible and I told him his idea for hiding in the Grand Canyon was absolutely stupid. He resigned eventually, but still wanted us to sneak out of our rooms and meet somewhere in the middle of the night. I didn't have the key card to get back in, and it was in the winter, so leaving the door cracked open would have woken people up with the chill. I stayed in. The next day he offhandedly mentioned that he waited for me, and offhandedly mentioned that a boy from one of the other classes had been there. Something about it felt wrong. I didn't trust the kid and he gave me the creeps. It bothered me that the pretense was originally just the two of us hanging out, and then he changed it without telling me. Just bad vibes. Later in the year he seemed to have some issues and started boasting about knowing how to make pipe bombs and shit. Sharknado3 said, had something like that in my hometown, only like, way smaller scale. There was these abandoned trailers at the end of a dirt road past the cemetery. We used to root around in them because it was spooky and they were decrepit, so it made for a thrilling night. Small town living, am I right? Anyway, I went during the day to look around and noticed a bunch of bills on the table dated in the 70s, same with a bunch of uncashed checks. The fridge still had very gnarly groceries from the 70s including sodas and things like that. Cabinets had items in it like cleaning supplies, etc. Closets were full with clothes, bed schmade, etc. It was like a snapshot in time from the 70s. I still do not know what happened to this family, or why they just up and left. Wildo Thing said, late 90s, a natural gas compressor station was built next door to me. Entire neighborhood protested it hard. But we were just dumb farmers, and gas companies have money. Shortly after it was built, in the middle of the night, it sprung a leak. Compressed gas spewed into the air like a geyser and there was now a jet black cloud next door. Not that I could see much anyway at that hour. The sound it made was so loud, it would make a foghorn sound like a squeaky toy. Anyway, we evacuated, Get to the other side of town to some family and watched the news. Apparently it ended quickly enough. They estimated $13 million worth of natural gas was shot into the environment. So we go back. Reporters talk to my dad and stuff. Then two men show up, hand something to each news company, and everyone leaves immediately. My family and my neighbors are standing there like WTF. Where did the reporters go? Within the hour, it was no longer on the news. If you Google it, you'll find no trace of it. They just made that story disappear. Eco said. Speaking of not reported accidents. My dad worked in a factory that did some kind of processing of chemicals that went to do something with food. I don't know much about it or what he did, I just know he hated the job. Well, the one day my dad decides to call out sick, the entire factory explodes. 3 people died. Half the tiny town it was located in was evacuated. Some homes were destroyed. Huge deal. Then, nothing. Dad got 3 months of pay randomly deposited in his bank account. He was sent a thanks for the many years of work, but we are closing our doors. Letter, and nothing ever came of it. There were hundreds of people in that town that lost homes, neighbors, family, friends, but if you Google Kansas Town factory explodes or something like that, nothing comes up, least, not for my dad's factory. Matronu said. Story from my grandpa. Small farm town Nebraska is in the 60s. A guy was found burnt alive in his car, hands wire tied to the steering wheel. It ruled as a suicide. Most of the town assumed that the guy owed gambling debts to some mob in Chicago or the like, and the guy wasn't exactly loved in the small town, so there was no real looking into it. Dude Gabor said. Here's a perfect example. https://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/Ken_MC Elroy. McElroy was shot to death in broad daylight as he sat with his wife Trina in his pickup truck on Skidmore's Main Street. 2. He was struck by bullets from at least 2 different firearms, in front of a crowd of people estimated as between 30 and 46. 1. To date, no one has been charged in connection with McElroy's death. 1. Only Trina claimed to identify a gunman. Every other witness either was unable to name an assailant or claimed not to have seen who fired the fatal shots. 12. The DA declined to press charges. An extensive federal investigation did not lead to any charges. One local resident later told investigators when asked what happened, he needed a kill-in. Dumb and concerned said. Dear God, this wife Trina was a 14-year-old girl at the time. She was 12 and he was 35 when they met. He raped her several times, then as she was the only witness, forced her into a marriage to avoid charges. He burned her family's home down and killed their dog to force them to consent to the marriage. He forced her out of school and moved her in with him and his second wife, Alice, who he divorced in order to marry Trina. After the birth of Trina's baby at 14, both Trina and Alice escaped together back to Trina's parents' home. He found them and once again burned their family's home down and killed their new dog, and took them back by force. I have to agree. This man needed a killing. And Steiger83 said. The comment says he might have owed gambling debts to the mob. Sounds like suicide to me. XD. Reminded me of a quote in a Terry Pratchett Discworld novel. Murder was in fact a fairly uncommon event in Ankh-Morpork, but there were a lot of suicides. Walking in the nighttime alleyways of the Shades was suicide. Asking for a short in a dwarf bar was suicide. Saying got rocks in your head to a troll was suicide. You could commit suicide very easily, if you weren't careful. Toposaurus said. Okay, what would they do with the bones and flesh? Did the factory use slye or something that could dissolve the flesh and bones? There is a documentary about a guy who was upper management at a plastics factory who murdered an illegal immigrant he had gotten pregnant. He put her body in a 55-gallon drum in some kind of dye or something and stored it all in his basement for 30 years or some such while raising a family there. Curious what he told his children life was in the drum. Eventually he sold the place and left it there. The new owner put it out for removal, but at around 300 pounds, the garbage company refused to remove it. So the guy looked in and found the body. They were able to solve the crime as the killer put the girl's address book in the drum and it was still readable. Further, the number of her best friend was still her best friend's number and she was the last person to see the girl before she disappeared, going to meet the man who had promised to marry her. Just imagine if the garbage truck had just removed the drum. Calliope Penelope said, "Back in 2001, a friend of my friend had been secretly chatting online with a guy from Canada. They had made plans to meet up in Windsor or Detroit. A few days later, her body was found dumped in the woods. After doing some digging, police got a hold of the Canadian guy. He said he went to meet her, but she never showed, so he assumed she had stood them up. His story checked out. One suspect was this co-worker, but a few months later he did a murder-suicide to his mom, so they could never get the truth out of him. It's been a cold case ever since." Edit. This was her co-worker, not Canada guys. She would have traveled 7-8 hours to meet the guy in Detroit, Windsor, assuming she even made it out of town. Derp said, "Pretty recent, January this year. I'm in a village so it's even smaller. I live right next to a river, and one day after rain my grandpa went searching for snails, but he found a head still with some flesh. A neighbor had also found an arm around the same time. The police were called. They found the body and a few dogs chewing on it, but it was in a bag hanging from a tree above the river. At first it was assumed it was from the big city thrown into the river, but no, it's hanging from the damn tree. The weirdest thing is that the woman was not from the village itself.